Why did the hallway feel like it was holding its breath when she stepped into it, laundry warm against her arm, as if the building itself knew what was about to be revealed? She had learned long before rank and ribbons that silence had weight. Commander Riley Keene carried it easily, the way some people carried confidence. Others mistook it for softness. At Hickory Joint Operations Base, silence was a language everyone spoke but few questioned. She arrived without ceremony, a nameplate most people skimmed past, a presence that didn't demand attention. That was intentional. The base had a rhythm, casual jokes, half-checked protocols, cameras that sometimes worked. And the women moved through it carefully, voices lowered, shoulders set, learning where not to walk after dark. Riley watched. She always did. She noticed the stairwell no one used, the warning tape too clean to be old, the way laughter stopped when a woman entered the room, then resumed sharper when she left. She felt the familiar pull between action and patience, between the instinct to step in and the discipline to let patterns expose themselves. She wasn't here to be liked. She was here because someone had learned to disappear without leaving a trace. At night, the annex quieted. It was the kind of quiet that amplified intention. Riley chose the laundry room because routine was camouflage. When she heard the laughter, low, rehearsed, it didn't spike fear. It clarified it. She stepped into the blind corner and saw them not as threats but as men convinced the rules were optional. They spoke like ownership was assumed. They closed space the way they always had. Riley let the moment stretch until the line was crossed. Not because she wanted it to, but because proof mattered. When it happened, she moved with economy. No wasted motion, no anger, just consequence. The hallway filled with stunned stillness, the kind that follows a truth no one prepared for. She didn't chase, she didn't shout. She secured what mattered, evidence, names, time. When help arrived, she stood calm amid the wreckage of their certainty. Silence, she knew, could be an instrument. Used correctly, it cut deeper than noise. What none of them understood yet was that this wasn't the climax. It was the opening, and the system that had relied on shadows had just been dragged into the light. Why did the reports start pouring in after midnight? As if a dam had cracked the moment someone finally stood still enough to listen. Riley sat at a bare desk, reading words written by people who had learned to compress their pain into safe sentences. Each message carried the same undertone. We thought it was just us. She felt the familiar ache, not pity, not rage, but resolve. She cataloged, cross-referenced, and traced the negative space where accountability should have lived. Patterns emerged, transfers, dismissals, smiles that closed doors quietly. She moved through the base like a ghost with a clipboard, opening files others had sealed with indifference. Names repeated. A group chat joked about safe zones. A signature on a memo that said misunderstanding where there had been fear. Riley didn't editorialize. She didn't need to. Systems convicted themselves when given enough room. By morning, command knew something had shifted. Not because alarms sounded, but because routines were interrupted. Cameras came back online. Patrols doubled. Men who'd walked with swagger now watched their steps. Riley met the base commander with a file thick enough to bend the desk. He read without interrupting. When he looked up, his authority had changed shape. It was heavier now. She asked for reviews, external eyes, reopened cases. She asked for consequences that didn't vanish with reassignment. Most of all, she asked for the base to stop confusing quiet with compliance. He agreed because the evidence left no refuge. Outside, the day unfolded like any other, but women stood a little straighter. A nod passed between strangers that said, "You're not alone." Riley noticed, then looked away. This wasn't about her. It never was. It was about restoring a boundary so basic it should never have needed defending. She left Hickory the way she arrived. No speech, no victory lap, just the weight of work done properly. As the transport pulled away, she watched the gates recede and thought of the stories that would never be told because harm had been interrupted before it could become legacy. What if strength isn't loud? What if resilience doesn't announce itself at all? Riley understood that dignity rarely raises its voice. It documents. It waits. It acts when the moment is undeniable. And when it does, it doesn't just stop what's happening. It changes what's allowed to happen next. Sometimes silence isn't surrender. Sometimes it's strategy. And sometimes dignity doesn't speak. It simply acts. Why did the first report land at 0007 like a confession whispered into a locked room? And why did Riley feel the base exhale when she opened it? She didn't rush. Rushing made noise, and noise made people defensive. Riley sat still at the small desk in her annex room, the overhead light humming with institutional fatigue, and read the message twice. It was short, almost apologetic: dates, a location, a name spelled wrong on purpose. The tone wasn't angry, it was tired. That was the detail that settled into her chest. Anger burns out. Fatigue lingers. Fatigue tells you someone has been carrying something alone for too long. By the time she finished the second report, the hallway outside her door had begun to stir, not with footsteps, but with the kind of awareness that spreads before words do. Systems sense disruption the way animals sense weather. She could feel it in the cadence of radio chatter drifting through the wall, in the way doors opened and closed a beat slower than usual. The base was waking up to the idea that the quiet it relied on had been interrupted. Riley cataloged each report with the same care she'd used on missions overseas. No judgment, no assumptions, facts first, patterns later. She cross-referenced names against duty rosters, dates against maintenance logs, locations against camera blind spots. The map grew on her screen not visually but in her mind, like a constellation forming from scattered points of light. The stairwell appeared again and again. The annex, late hours, jokes framed as misunderstandings. Transfers framed as opportunities. She paused once, fingers hovering over the keyboard, when a report ended with a single line. "I didn't want to be difficult." Riley leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. She'd heard that sentence in a dozen languages on bases with different flags. It always meant the same thing. Someone had learned that endurance was safer than honesty. That survival meant adaptation, not confrontation. The moral weight of that lesson pressed against her ribs. At 0112, her secure line chimed. Legal, calm voice, no preamble. "We've reviewed the footage." Riley listened, said little. Authorization came through in clipped phrases, each one removing another layer of insulation that had protected the base from scrutiny. Temporary investigative authority, external review permitted, past cases reopened. Riley thanked them and ended the call, the room suddenly quieter for having absorbed those words. She stood and stretched, feeling the long day settle into her muscles. Not exhaustion, focus. She pulled on her jacket and stepped into the corridor. Two security officers stood near the stairwell now, posture alert, eyes avoiding the taped door like it might accuse them. Riley didn't acknowledge them beyond a nod. She didn't need allies yet. She needed witnesses. In the admin wing, she requested access logs without explanation. The clerk complied, hands a little shaky, eyes flicking to Riley's rank and then away. Riley noticed but didn't soften her voice. Kindness could come later. Precision came first. She traced badge swipes to time windows and noticed the gaps, the minutes that never quite lined up with official movement. Someone had learned how to step between systems. By 0200, the anonymous inbox filled faster than she could read. Some messages were fragmented, written like the sender expected to be interrupted. Others were meticulous, dates and times listed as if the act of ordering the experience made it survivable. Riley read them all. She resisted the urge to respond, to reassure. This phase wasn't about comfort. It was about credibility. A knock came at 0217. Soft, hesitant. Riley opened the door to find a junior medic standing there, hands clasped tight, eyes red but steady. "Ma'am," she said, then stopped as if unsure what came next. Riley stepped aside. "Come in." The medic didn't sit. She spoke quickly, like she was afraid courage had an expiration date. She named the stairwell, a laugh that had followed, a transfer request denied. Riley listened without interrupting, her face unreadable. When the medic finished, Riley asked two clarifying questions: dates, names. Then she thanked her, not performatively, precisely. After the door closed, Riley stood still for a long moment. This was the part people didn't see. The accumulation. The way stories layered until they felt heavier than any pack she'd carried. She reminded herself of the difference between absorbing pain and honoring it. She chose the latter. At dawn, the base commander's office smelled like burnt coffee and old paper. Colonel Rohr didn't waste time. He looked like a man who'd been running behind his own authority all night. Riley laid the file on his desk without flourish. He opened it and read in silence. The room held that silence carefully, like a fragile instrument. "This will be ugly," he said finally. "It already is," Riley replied. Her voice wasn't sharp, it was level. "We're just removing the cover." He nodded once, the nod of someone recognizing the difference between reputation and responsibility. He agreed to her terms with a speed that surprised even him. External investigators, leadership freezes, reopened cases. When he hesitated, Riley didn't push. She waited. Waiting had a way of clarifying priorities. By mid-morning, the base felt different. Not safer yet, safer takes time, but awake. Conversations paused when Riley passed, not because of fear but because of recalibration. People were measuring what could be said now, what would be heard. She moved through it with deliberate neutrality. No smiles, no scowls, just presence. In the chow line, two women stood a little closer together than before. Riley caught their eyes and looked away deliberately. This wasn't about becoming a symbol. Symbols attract projection. She wanted process. Process endured. The first interview began at 10:30, then another, then another. Riley asked the same questions each time, her tone steady, her body language open but firm. She let silences stretch. People filled them with truth more often than lies. When someone minimized their own experience, she noted it. Minimization was a learned reflex. It spoke volumes about the environment. By afternoon, the shape of the problem was unmistakable. Not a few bad actors, a pattern of permission. The base hadn't been cruel, it had been convenient. Convenience had done the rest. As the sun dipped, Riley stood by the annex stairwell, now guarded and lit, and watched technicians replace the camera dome. She felt a flicker of something like relief, then dismissed it. Hardware was easy. Culture wasn't. Culture required memory. It required people to remember that rules existed for a reason and that silence was not neutral. She returned to her room and typed until her fingers ached. Every word mattered. Reports weren't stories, they were tools. She wrote with restraint, knowing restraint carried authority. When she finished, she saved the file and leaned back, eyes closed. She thought of the medic, of the sentence about not wanting to be difficult, of the way systems taught people to disappear. Riley opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling, feeling the quiet settle again. Not the dangerous quiet of neglect, but the purposeful quiet of work being done. Tomorrow would bring resistance. It always did. But tonight something had shifted, not dramatically, not loudly, just enough. And Riley knew, as she shut off the light, that the most difficult part wasn't exposing what had happened. It was insisting that it be remembered. Why did the room feel colder when the first leader sat down across from her, even though the air conditioning hadn't changed? Riley noticed temperature shifts the way other people noticed tone. It was never about the thermostat. It was about resistance. The officer across from her, mid-level, polished, practiced, kept his back straight and his answers shorter than necessary. He wasn't hostile. That was the problem. Hostility could be cataloged. What he brought instead was professional discomfort, the kind that tried to frame itself as reason. "We've never had issues like this before," he said carefully, as if the sentence itself could be evidence. Riley didn't challenge him. She let the silence do the work. It stretched long enough for him to add, at least nothing formally substantiated. There it was, the space where truth hid. Riley asked him to walk her through the reporting process. He did confidently. She asked him how often reports resulted in action. He paused. She asked him how often transfers followed reports. He cleared his throat. Riley wrote nothing down. She didn't need to. The interview wasn't about extracting facts. It was about watching where certainty thinned. As the day moved on, the tone shifted from cooperative to cautious. Leaders realized this wasn't a compliance check that could be navigated with the right language. This was an audit of memory. Riley asked about jokes, about nicknames, about known problem areas. Each time, the answer leaned on ambiguity. She recognized it from her own early years, the way people convinced themselves that not nomming something made them neutral. Between interviews, Riley walked the base. She watched formations reset. She watched women choose routes that added minutes to their day. She watched men joke and then glance around, recalibrating volume. Accountability had a gravity to it. It bent behavior even before consequences arrived. In the afternoon, she sat with a senior NCO who spoke plainly, his voice rough with age and regret. "I thought keeping it quiet was protecting the unit," he said. "Didn't realize who it was protecting." Riley felt something ease in her chest, not relief but recognition. This was the crack. Not everyone would take responsibility, but some would understand it. That mattered. Systems changed when enough people stopped defending their comfort. By early evening, word had spread beyond the annex. The base wasn't buzzing, it was subdued, the kind of subdued that followed an internal reckoning. Riley returned to her room and found another note under the door. No name, just a sentence. "I thought no one would ever listen." She folded it and placed it inside her notebook, not as evidence but as reminder. The pushback arrived after dinner. A call from higher, measured but sharp, questions about scope, about impact, about whether this might damage morale. Riley listened, then responded evenly. "Morale built on silence isn't morale," she said. "It's avoidance." There was a pause, then a sigh, then consent, not enthusiastic, but sufficient. Riley understood compromise. She just refused to let it erase responsibility. That night she dreamed, not of the hallway but of a different base, years ago where she'd been younger and less certain. She remembered a moment when she'd stayed quiet because speaking felt heavier than enduring. The memory didn't shame her. It clarified her resolve. She woke before dawn with the taste of it still present and sat on the edge of the bed, grounding herself in the now. The next morning brought interviews with those who hadn't reported. Riley approached them differently. She didn't ask why. Why implied fault. She asked what it cost them to stay silent. The answers were immediate: sleep, trust, ambition, the belief that the uniform protected everyone equally. Riley nodded, absorbing the weight without taking it on as her own. At midday she met with the base psychologist. The conversation was clinical, careful, and quietly devastating. Patterns of stress, anxiety mislabeled as performance issues, recommendations filed and forgotten. Riley requested anonymized summaries. The psychologist hesitated, then complied. This, too, was part of the system. Help offered without follow-through, compassion without teeth. Outside the office, Riley paused and watched a group of recruits jogging past, cadence steady, faces set with early optimism. She wondered what invisible lessons they were already learning, which corners to avoid, which jokes to laugh at, which discomforts to swallow. She wondered how many would leave before they ever understood why. The first formal resistance came that afternoon, a memo questioning her authority, carefully worded, legalistic. Riley read it once, then forwarded it with her credentials attached and a single sentence: "Authority confirmed." The reply came minutes later, apology included. Resistance often folded when confronted with clarity. By evening, fatigue crept in, not physical but ethical. The strain of holding so many stories without letting them harden her. Riley took a walk along the perimeter fence, boots crunching on gravel, breathing in the dry air. She reminded herself why she'd chosen this path. Not because she enjoyed confrontation, but because neglect was louder in the long run. She stopped near the motor pool and watched mechanics work under floodlights, hands moving with practiced ease. Work done well had a calming effect. It was honest. She stood there until the tension eased, then turned back toward the annex. Inside, she drafted the interim report. It was spare, unemotional. It named failures without embellishment. It recommended actions without apology. When she finished, she read it once, then signed her name. As she shut down her computer, Riley felt a flicker of doubt, not about the facts, about the aftermath. Change always carried collateral. Careers would end. Reputations would fracture. She let the doubt exist without letting it decide. Moral work was rarely comfortable. Comfort was not the metric. She lay down, eyes open in the dark, listening to the bass settle into night again. This time the quiet felt different, not complicit, anticipatory, like a held breath before something irreversible. And Riley understood with a clarity that steadied her that exposure was only the first step. The harder work, the slower work, was teaching a system to live with the truth once it had been seen. What happens after the truth is spoken, when the adrenaline drains, and all that's left is the long work of standing by it? Riley felt the shift before anyone said it out loud. The base had crossed from shock into strategy. Doors closed more softly now. Conversations ended when she entered a room, not because people feared her, but because they were choosing words carefully for the first time. Care was new here. Care made people uneasy. The interim report moved up the chain before noon. Riley knew because the calls changed. Fewer pleasantries, more pauses. She answered questions the way she always did, precisely, without ornament. When asked about impact, she returned to evidence. When asked about optics, she returned to obligation. She didn't argue, she didn't persuade, she documented. Documentation had a way of outlasting opinion. By mid-morning, the first temporary reassignments were issued. Quiet notices, neutral language, the kind that pretended not to be consequences. Riley watched the orders pass through admin and felt the familiar tension between satisfaction and restraint. This wasn't justice. It was containment, necessary but incomplete. She spent the afternoon with investigators who arrived without insignia on their jackets. Civilian clothes, neutral expressions. They listened more than they spoke. Riley briefed them on the patterns, the blind spots, the informal permissions. She pointed to the stairwell not as a location, but as a symbol of how neglect calcified into entitlement. They nodded. One of them asked, "How long do you think this has been going on?" Riley didn't answer immediately. She hated guessing. "Long enough to feel normal," she said finally. That seemed to satisfy them. Later, she sat in on an interview where a man tried to recast himself as confused. "I didn't think it was serious," he said, eyes darting. Riley watched his hands. They were steady. Confusion shook people. Rationalization steadied them. She asked him to define serious. He couldn't without revealing himself. The room filled with the uncomfortable clarity that followed. Accountability often sounded like quiet embarrassment. In the hallway afterward, a junior officer approached her and stopped short, as if unsure of the distance he was allowed to stand now. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "it's changing things." Riley met his eyes. "It already had," she replied. "You're just noticing." As evening settled, fatigue crept in again. Not the bone-deep kind, but the moral kind. The weight of knowing that for every voice now being heard, there were others still measuring the cost. Riley returned to her room and found a folded paper slipped under the door. 3 words written carefully: "I reported today." No signature. Riley pressed the paper flat with her palm, then tucked it into her notebook. She allowed herself a single breath of something like relief. Then she let it go. Night brought the harder conversations. Calls from leaders who wanted to understand where the line was now. Riley explained that the line hadn't moved. It had been ignored. When someone suggested that morale might suffer, she asked whose morale they meant. The silence that followed told her enough. She stepped outside and walked toward the annex, the air cool against her face. The stairwell was sealed now, guarded, illuminated. It looked smaller under the light, less powerful. Riley stood there for a moment, feeling the quiet settle without menace. She thought about how places acquired meaning, not from architecture, but from what was tolerated inside them. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. Another base, another time, a younger version of herself choosing not to speak because the math didn't work yet. She remembered the cost of that choice, not catastrophic but cumulative, the slow narrowing of trust. She hadn't known then that silence, once practiced, became habit. The thought sharpened her resolve. The following morning, the base commander requested a private meeting. He looked older than he had 2 days ago. Responsibility aged people quickly. "I keep thinking," he said, staring at the file on his desk, "about what I missed." Riley didn't correct him. Missing wasn't the point. Ignoring was. She said only, "What you do next will matter more than what you didn't see." He nodded. They discussed training changes, reporting pathways, external oversight schedules. Riley insisted on timelines. Vague commitments dissolved under pressure. Timelines held. By afternoon, the investigators requested access to past transfer records. Riley facilitated without comment. Watching the system open itself felt strange, like witnessing a structure loosen bolts it had tightened for years. Necessary but unsettling. Change rarely felt clean. A young woman stopped Riley near the motor pool, eyes bright with a mix of fear and gratitude. "I didn't think anyone would stay," she said. Riley understood the question beneath the statement. "I'm here until the work is done," she replied. It wasn't a promise of rescue. It was a promise of process. That night, Riley sat alone and reviewed her notes. Patterns confirmed. Enablers identified. Recommendations sharpened. She wrote until the words blurred, then stopped. Overworking dulled judgment. She closed the notebook and leaned back, listening to the base breathe. She wondered how many people believed that accountability was an event, a moment, a headline. She knew better. Accountability was maintenance. It required repetition, humility, and the willingness to be uncomfortable more than once. Before sleep, she drafted a short addendum. It wasn't required, but it mattered. She wrote about culture not as a buzzword but as a series of daily choices, about how small permissions accumulated, about how silence taught lessons faster than policy ever could. She ended with a line she'd learned the hard way: correction is not punishment, it is care applied too late and then on time. When she turned off the light, the doubt returned briefly, not about the truth, but about endurance. Would the system keep choosing the harder path once she left? She couldn't control that. She could only make leaving harder than changing. Sleep came slowly, but it came, and when it did, it wasn't haunted. It was steady. The kind of sleep earned by standing where the truth asked you to stand, even when it cost something. Tomorrow would bring hearings, statements, pushback wrapped in politeness. Riley was ready, not because she was fearless, but because she had learned that courage wasn't loud, it was sustained. And somewhere in the base, a quiet recalibration continued, subtle, fragile, real learning, for the first time, that silence was no longer the safest option. Why did the air feel heavier on the morning of the hearing? As if the base itself understood that this was the point of no return. Riley woke before her alarm, the gray light pressing softly through the blinds. She lay still, listening to the distant sounds of a base coming alive, engines turning over, boots on concrete, radios clearing their throats. This was the day the story stopped being whispered and started being archived. She felt the familiar tension behind her eyes, not fear but responsibility. The kind that didn't ask whether you were ready. It just showed up. The hearing room was plain by design. No flags, no portraits, just a long table and chairs that discouraged comfort. Investigators sat on one side, command representatives on the other. Riley took her place without ceremony. She noticed who avoided her gaze and who held it too long, trying to read the ending before it was written. The first statements were procedural, timelines, locations, verified facts. Riley spoke when asked, her voice level, her answers precise. She didn't embellish, she didn't need to. The evidence spoke in the language systems respected dates, logs, recordings. When the video played, the room went still, not shocked, sobered, the kind of stillness that followed clarity. A senior officer cleared his throat. "This could have been handled internally," he said, carefully neutral. Riley waited a beat. It was, she replied. For years, that's the problem. No one argued after that. Arguments required uncertainty. This room had very little left. As the hours passed, the narrative shifted. It stopped being about one hallway one night. It became about patterns, how complaints were rerouted, how language softened harm until it fit into a box labeled misunderstanding. Riley watched realization spread slowly, unevenly. Some people leaned forward, others leaned back. Accountability had a way of rearranging posture. During a break, Riley stepped outside and breathed in the cool air. She felt oddly calm. This was the part people imagined as dramatic, but drama had burned off days ago. What remained was endurance. She thought of the women who had written in the early hours, unsure if anyone would ever read their words. She carried them with her now, not as a burden but as ballast. Back inside, testimony from leadership began. Some accepted responsibility without deflection. Riley noted them carefully. Others hedged, citing workload, ambiguity, competing priorities. Riley listened without interruption. When asked for her assessment, she spoke simply. Ambiguity is a choice, she said. So is clarity. The room absorbed that. It would be quoted later, she knew. Not because it was clever, but because it was accurate. By late afternoon, conclusions formed. Recommendations hardened into directives. Leadership freezes extended. External oversight mandated, training overhauled, reporting lines simplified. None of it felt triumphant. It felt necessary. Riley signed where required, her signature steady. Paperwork was rarely heroic, but it was where change learned to live. As the hearing adjourned, a woman she didn't recognize approached, eyes wet but determined. I stayed, she said. Riley understood the weight of those two words. Staying wasn't passive. Staying was an act. Riley nodded once. Then help make it better, she replied. It was the only encouragement that mattered. The aftermath unfolded quietly. Orders issued. Offices reshuffled. Conversations continued behind closed doors. Riley spent the evening reviewing final drafts, ensuring language didn't soften consequences into suggestions. She corrected phrasing that implied this was an anomaly. It was. It was a reckoning. Later, she walked the perimeter again, a habit now. The sky burned orange at the edges, the day surrendering to night. She felt the ache in her shoulders and welcomed it. It reminded her she was still present, still engaged. A message came through from higher command before midnight. Commendation language, appreciation. Riley read it once and archived it. Praise wasn't the point. Outcome was. She replied with a brief confirmation and returned to her notes. She thought about departure. Her orders would end soon. The system would continue without her. That was how it had to be. She made one last request before sleep. Scheduled follow-up audits at 6 and 12 months, external eyes attached. Future accountability wasn't optional. It was planned. In her room, she packed slowly, folding uniforms with care. Each fold felt like punctuation. She paused with the notebook in her hands, the one filled with names and moments and quiet courage. She considered leaving it behind, then shook her head. Memory needed a carrier. Before turning in, she wrote one final entry, not for the record, for herself. She wrote about the cost of silence and the price of speaking, about how strength often arrived disguised as patience, about how dignity didn't announce itself with force but with follow-through. Sleep came easier than she expected, not because the work was finished but because it was anchored. When she dreamed, it wasn't of hallways or hearings. It was of open spaces, daylight, movement without calculation. Morning would bring her departure. There would be no ceremony. There never was. But as she drifted off, Riley allowed herself a quiet certainty. Something fundamental had shifted. Not perfectly, not permanently, but enough. And sometimes, enough was the beginning of everything. What does leaving look like when you know the place you're walking away from will never quite be the same? Riley stood on the tarmac before sunrise, the air thin and cool, the sky a patient gray. The transport waited with its door open, quiet and utilitarian, like it didn't want to draw attention to endings. She carried one bag, she always did. The rest, files, notes, consequences, had already been handed off to systems that would outlast her presence. That was the point. If it needed her to stay to survive, it wasn't fixed. A few people watched from a distance. Not a formation, not a send-off, just individuals pausing in their routines, recalibrating how to stand when someone left without applause. Riley didn't meet their eyes for long. Gratitude had weight too, and she didn't want it to tip into obligation. As the engines warmed, she thought about the hearings and the quiet aftermath, about the way directives had landed like stones in still water, rippling outward into training schedules and reporting chains and conversations that would never again pretend not to hear. She thought about resistance, too, the polite kind that learned new words but kept old instincts. Change was rarely clean. It was iterative. It demanded repetition. She climbed the steps and took her seat, fastening the belt with practiced ease. When the door closed, it wasn't dramatic, just final. The aircraft taxied, turned, and lifted. The base fell away beneath her, lines and roofs and roads shrinking into abstraction. From above, it looked orderly. It always did. In the hours that followed, Riley reviewed nothing. She didn't draft addendums or check messages. She let the silence be just silence. It felt earned. She watched the clouds and remembered the first note slipped under her door, the 3 words, the courage it took to write them. Courage didn't announce itself. It showed up small and stayed. When the plane landed, she stepped into a different air, a different light, another base, another mission waiting in the margins. She checked in, nodded to the duty officer, and moved on. Her reputation preceded her now, sometimes as rumor, sometimes as relief. She didn't cultivate either. Labels narrowed the work. Days later, the reports began to filter back. Not to her directly, she'd set that boundary, but through channels she trusted. Oversight schedules met, training rewritten with input from those who had been ignored before. Leadership rotations adjusted. A few resignations framed as personal decisions. A few separations framed as administrative. Language softened the edges, but the edges remained. Consequences had texture. There were setbacks. Of course there were. A delayed hearing. A memo that tried to reframe accountability as disruption. Riley read about it in a summary and felt the familiar tug between impatience and realism. She chose realism. Change that endured moved slower than outrage and faster than denial. It lived in the middle. One evening, weeks later, she received a secure message forwarded from a base counselor she'd met only once. No names, just outcomes. Utilization up, reporting increased, sleep improved in small, measurable ways. Riley closed the message and sat quietly. Metrics were imperfect, but they mattered. They were proof that something invisible had shifted. She thought about the men, too, not with sympathy that excused, but with clarity that contextualized. Accountability wasn't revenge. It was interruption. It stopped a pattern from becoming inheritance. She hoped, in the way one hopes without obligation, that consequences would teach what entitlement never could. That silence would lose its cover. At night, Riley ran. She always did. The cadence of breath and footfall steadied her. As she moved through the dark, she let memories surface and pass without gripping them. The hallway, the hearing room, the perimeter fence. Each had taught her something different about courage. None of it was cinematic. All of it was necessary. On a quiet weekend, she opened her notebook and read the entries she'd avoided since leaving. Names, dates, sentences that ended without punctuation, as if the writers hadn't known how to stop. She didn't reread to relive. She reread to remember why the work mattered when it became tedious, when resistance dressed itself up as reason. She added one more page at the back. Not a report, a reflection. She wrote about how systems learned from what they tolerated, about how dignity could be restored, but trust had to be rebuilt plank by plank, about how silence was never neutral, it either protected or it abandoned. Months passed. Follow-up audits came and went. Some recommendations held, others required reinforcement. Riley stayed on the right side of persistence, pushing without becoming the story. She didn't return to Hickory. She didn't need to. The measure of success wasn't presence, it was continuity. One afternoon, a junior officer approached her after a briefing at a different installation. Nervous, earnest. "Ma'am," she said, "I heard what you did at—" Riley raised a hand gently. "What they did," she corrected. "I just documented it." The officer nodded, absorbing the distinction. It mattered. Later, alone, Riley allowed herself a rare smile. Small, private, not triumph, recognition. She knew the work would never be finished. It didn't end with one base or one audit. It was maintenance. It was vigilance. It was choosing discomfort now so others didn't have to later. On the anniversary of the hearing, she received a single line through a secure channel, unsigned. "I didn't transfer. I got promoted." Riley stared at the words longer than she needed to. Then she closed the message and stood, the room quiet around her. She understood then what redemption looked like in real time. Not absolution, not applause, opportunity restored, dignity unburdened, a future widened by someone else's willingness to stand still when standing still was hardest. That night, Riley turned off the light and let the quiet settle. It wasn't the dangerous quiet of neglect. It was the deliberate quiet of systems paying attention, of people choosing differently because the cost of silence had finally been made visible. She drifted toward sleep with a thought she'd learned to trust. Strength didn't always rush in. Sometimes it waited. Sometimes it documented. Sometimes it simply refused to look away. And when morning came, she rose without ceremony, ready to do it again if asked, knowing that the truest measure of success wasn't how loudly a story ended, but how quietly it changed what came next. Sometimes dignity doesn't speak, it simply acts.